Welcome back, everyone, to DWeb Decoded, a podcast by Filecoin Foundation that explores the intersection of blockchain and the data economy. I'm your host, Aaron Stanley, and today we have a very special episode with Jonathan Schwartz, who's the CEO of GLIF. Today we're going to be talking about Jonathan's journey in the world of Filecoin and what he's been building with GLIF as of late. Jonathan, thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So, Jonathan, you've been a really prolific contributor in the world of Filecoin, IPFS, since really the early days. And to get started, I would just like for you to introduce yourself, tell us about how you got interested in blockchain, tell us how you kind of came into this world of IPFS and Filecoin.
Absolutely. So I will take you back to 2017. I was working at Consensus, the Ethereum development company, I would say. And I was working on specifically a project called Ujo Music. Have you heard of Ujo by any chance?
I remember this.
Okay, you do?
Yeah.
Back in the day. Yeah, this must have been 2017, 2018. And Ujo Music was at the time trying to kind of create technology in the intersection of crypto and music. And most importantly, we were storing all of our fan data and music data on IPFS. So that was like my first introduction to distributed storage and also some of the issues that could arise with location-based web, like just kind of how HTTP works and what could be alternatives that IPFS can introduce, and eventually Filecoin, this like incentivized version of IPFS. And this seemed like really, really interesting to me. I was inspired by this talk. I always go back to this talk in interviews like these with a talk from Juan Benet at the Long Now Foundation with Stuart Brand, where he's talking about creating long-term info structures, like very robust ways to store humanity's knowledge and information as a mechanism for preserving like humanity over long periods of time. I found this to be really cool. My family works a lot in medicine and academia, and so there's this notion of like brownie points in doing work. And so IPFS and what would be Filecoin and this ecosystem to me represented enough of the problem solving and engineering things that I really enjoyed doing just with my mind, and also feeling good like, hey, the things that we're building are actually potentially useful for some type of doomsday scenario down the road. Hopefully it never happens, but it felt like we were contributing to more than just silly crypto games or anything like that at that time. And so long story short, I actually left my job and with a friend started a development studio specifically for building custom IPFS storage solutions for crypto protocols. In that time, it was a lot of like DAOs and similar types of very experimental projects that had a lot of money from the 2017 bull run and wanted to build tech that kind of aligned with their decentralized narratives and that sort of cypherpunk OG crypto religious ideology, you could say. And that was an amazing time for me. I could talk so long about just that. Fast forward a little bit longer, and Protocol Labs reached out to work with us directly to build the wallet for Filecoin's mainnet launch, which went really well. So they said, hey, do you want to build the multisig for the ICO distribution? And we said, of course. And then the sort of more opportunities kept coming like this. So GLIF, when it was born, was actually sort of this umbrella brand that represented a suite of apps and tools that we were building for Filecoin's mainnet launch. And fast forward another, I would say, year, maybe year and a half, the Filecoin Foundation reached out and said, hey, do you want to go solve problems for the network and build a team and kind of have a longer term, more committed relationship? And that was a major inflection point for GLIF, because prior to that, we were just kind of bootstrapping off grants and contract work. And now we had runway from the Filecoin Foundation. And so thank you for your support all the way back then. We've been working together for many years at this point. And I also always make the joke is why I'm always wearing a hat, because I've lost quite a bit of hair in the years of building here. But when we started building just more freely, we really noticed the lack of DeFi and sort of capital market support in Filecoin that would allow the Filecoin token holders to be able to put their tokens to use in the Filecoin network in a productive way to help scale the network up, make it more secure, and also as a side effect, earn some rewards in doing so. And the storage providers, who are the network's miners per se, they're the ones that are both providing the storage to Filecoin, but also securing the network via proofs. they had no permissionless way to access Filecoin to use for that storage mining process. So the Filecoin miners, or the storage providers, as we call them, they need to put down a pledge of a security deposit when they store data on the network, and that ensures that they act honestly. And so GLIF created the first DeFi protocol to close that gap and essentially create a more efficient market for Filecoin to operate on. And it worked really, really well. So that's been out for more than 2 years now, and it has grown exponentially over those first, year and a half. We've gotten more than 22 million Filecoin in deposits. There's been more than 17 million Filecoin that's been deployed to storage providers, and it's been a really fun ride. And so now we're kind of in the next inflection point of the company, which I'm sure we'll talk more about here. That was a long intro, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and it's incredible to see. Like, I mean, you've done like the full tour of duty in like the Filecoin world, right? You started off just building things for IPFS, and then helping. You're using it as like a as a builder in another ecosystem, and then you moved over to kind of deploying kind of custom solutions, helping other folks use IPFS, and all of a sudden you're building Filecoin wallet, you're building the multisig, so you've kind of done like the full like tour, like multiple tours of duty, I suppose, if we're going to use that terminology. But like, so as it stands today, then, so GLIF is, I think when most people nowadays think of GLIF, they think of the leasing pools, right, or the staking pools. But is that sort of the core product that you guys are maintaining at the moment, or are there still other projects that you are kind of dabbling as well within the Filecoin ecosystem specifically?
Yeah, so we the core product, I would say, like our favorite child, is definitely the DeFi work. We also maintain the Filecoin wallet that has been built since launch, and the Filecoin multisig. Those have kind of changed homes over the years, but the core functionality has been maintained and is supported. Those are public goods for the Filecoin ecosystem. And generally, I would say the wallet, the multisig, and the DeFi protocol are the three main products that GLIF is probably most well known for within the Filecoin ecosystem right now. Yeah, over the years we've built plenty of other products like faucets and data notaries, and we deployed the wrapped Filecoin token for the Filecoin DeFi ecosystem. So a bunch of other tools that have come up, but those are the three that have permeated the last many years.
Got it. And so I wanted to go back in time, like 2 years. I think probably about 2 years ago, almost to the day from when we were recording this, the FEVM went live, and this is what kind of brought programmability, smart contracts to the network, and this is sort of what enabled you to do what you're doing right now with the DeFi work, right? And I was hoping you could maybe just take us back to kind of what that was like in kind of being a part of that, and then obviously kind of bootstrapping this new product based off of that, and then. I think one of the things that is remarkable to me is, I mean, in crypto, like things are moving so fast, and we're always everything's just like forward all the time, and sometimes we forget to step back and like appreciate some of the things we've accomplished. And I think the FEVM was something that was a real like I don't think there's any other blockchain out there that's kind of retroactively added programmability into its kind of native core layer in a way that happened with Filecoin here. So I was hoping you could maybe like take a minute to kind of reminisce on like that event and like why that was significant, and then what that ended up unlocking.
Oh, absolutely. So when you think about Filecoin at its birth, it had 11, I would say, hard-coded smart contracts. So like the Filecoin multisig wallet was a smart contract on Filecoin in 2020, but it was hard-coded and maintained by the core Filecoin developing teams and through the FIP process, and less, I would say, a blank canvas to build on as a developer. Of course, we can build tools off-chain that interact with Filecoin as a blockchain. That had been what GLIF was doing up until, like 2 years ago. But the big unlock is that smart contract developers, after the FEVM launched, could actually deploy native functionality to Filecoin, the blockchain, not off-chain. And so that's a huge unlock, right? Like that's essentially, imagine you have an iPhone and there's only 11 apps on it and no app store, right? So the iPhone could still be useful. You could still make calls. You could still text, maybe use a calculator, but like I can't write my own apps and use the iPhone. And so the iPhone's functionality is then severely limited, right? And so having programmability at the smart contract layer allows you to do all sorts of really interesting things and run new types of experiments. So Filecoin is a blockchain for storage and different types of storage protocols. And so you can imagine in the first 11 hard coded smart contracts, there was one type of storage market that existed as a smart contract. And you can tell, like, that's obviously has opinions for how it should work. How should payments occur? What happens if like the storage is gone? There's all sorts of variables that can come up with different types of storage. And the one smart contract is not enough to kind of cover a lot of different use cases. So when you think about programmability, you basically unlock the app store that on Filecoin, and GLIF was very early on to jump on that train. We were building, of course, when an app store is in development, you have a long lead time to experiment with like the test app store. And so we were able to align with the core development team on timelines and launch our project very closely along the same timeline as the FEVM. And of course, without that, we would not have the DeFi product that we do today. And we'd be much further behind as a company, to be honest. So this has made GLIF, the FEVM, quite literally transitioned GLIF from being a company that would survive on grants and contract work to a company that now has a product that can actually earn revenue and does earn revenue. And that's like a huge inflection point for both GLIF, but also just like the silhouette of any builder, that the opportunities are now much, much greater.
Yeah, I love that. And then maybe let's talk a bit more about like just the product that you have right now, the Infinity Pool product. And maybe just tell us a bit about, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have their funds staked on GLIF, or they have some Filecoin staked on GLIF. They've used it, but maybe for folks who haven't necessarily used it, or for folks who have used it, they just don't really know kind of how it all works on the back end. Maybe kind of walk us through like just how the product actually works. How do storage providers go about accessing this capital for use in their pledge collateral?
Absolutely. So it's there's two sides, and they both rely on each other to exist in order for the full product to work. But we could talk about them separately. So let's start with the token holder side. I think this is a little more like familiar and simple. So on the token holder side, if you have Filecoin, you can deposit it into GLIF, which is just a pool of a bunch of other people's Filecoin as well. In return, you receive a token called IFIL, and IFIL is a wrapped version of Filecoin that earns rewards over time. So when, let's say you deposit some Filecoin into GLIF, then you get back some IFIL tokens. The next day, the amount of Filecoin that your same number of IFIL tokens are worth should be worth more in Filecoin than it was yesterday, right? So over time, the rewards from deploying this Filecoin to storage providers accrues, and that's how the liquidity providers, as we call them, the Filecoin token holders, make their returns for staking, essentially, into GLIF. And on the back end, the pool operates a lot like Aave in a sense. And for those who don't understand Aave, what Aave does is it allows you to put some collateral into GLIF, or Aave in this case, and use that collateral to borrow funds against it. And so it's kind of interesting in the case of GLIF, like in Aave, you might deposit, say, ETH as collateral and borrow USDC. But in GLIF, you actually collateralize your miner and you borrow Filecoin. So what that means is, let's say I'm a storage provider with a data center and I'm already mining Filecoin. I've already put data onto the network, which means I already have put some Filecoin, locked it into the network as a security deposit to store data. What that means is that I already have some Filecoin that's locked away as this miner. And so what GLIF allows you to do is basically allow us to take control over that miner and the ownership of it. And that acts as like collateral. And then in return, you can go borrow the Filecoin you need, put it on that miner, and still operate it. So the way that Filecoin is built, there's different roles and authorities so that the miner, which is just another hard-coded smart contract on Filecoin, one of the first 11, it has an owner, which is the only role that can actually take money out of that smart contract. And so by just setting GLIF to be the owner, we now have protection and we have safety. So that is basically how the storage providers they can get leverage to borrow Filecoin to use it for mining and scale up their operation. But let me know if that didn't make sense, or you need me to clarify
Yeah.
anything else.
So when you say miner on that's the actual contract that controls those funds, right? Essentially. So like they can basically
Exactly.
delegate control of that contract to you. And then once they repay, the same way that, like, I'm taking out a loan on my house or something, or I'm taking out a mortgage, like the bank technically owns the house until I actually pay the whole mortgage off, right? So you guys technically have that, you have the rights to that contract until the storage provider pays off the loan, essentially. Is that basically the same
That's
idea?
exactly right. And just for clarity of terminology, I generally call a storage provider a human or an organization that runs one or more Filecoin miner actors. And a Filecoin miner actor, which I'm calling miner, is the actual smart contract that allows the storage provider to put data online, pledge Filecoin, and earn rewards.
Got it. Okay, that's super helpful explanation there. And then, so maybe talk a bit about just like how to like a liquidity provider, like someone who's putting their Filecoin into the pool, like how do they go about doing that? And then how does a storage provider, like, can any storage provider just show up and take a loan, or is there, what's kind of the process beyond, or for doing that? Do you guys have to do, I assume there's some kind of like KYC or like onboarding, or what's the whole process for like onboarding clients on that side?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the reason that GLIF takes collateral is because in an event where the borrower misbehaves, say they unplug their data center from the wall, GLIF has the ownership over this miner in a way that allows us to take back the funds that were given to it and repay the liquidity providers. So, there's always, you can never call smart contracts risk-free. And anyone who ever does, you should be very skeptical of. There's always smart contract risk. There's always unexpected things. But from a theoretical standpoint, mathematically and economically in code, there is no way for the pool to actually lose money. If that storage provider starts misbehaving, then GLIF will recoup that money because we own that miner. And that's why owning that miner becomes very important. And as a result of this, because we can trust the math and the algorithms, we don't actually need to know who is on the storage providing side. It's a free market. And as long as they follow the rules, then the pool is safe. And that's generally how, like, crypto systems, I think, in some way have a huge advantage over meat space legal agreements, because if we were using anything like that, we would need a lot more assurance. We need to know who you are, all that sort of stuff. But as long as we're using math and smart contracts, the code is the one that's determining everything, and it's completely automated. It's very easy, what I'd say, like laissez-faire kind of thing, because it's a protocol and it just runs.
I love that. And then I know that there's also a number of kind of like centralized services in the Filecoin network where centralized lenders that storage providers can go to get access to Filecoin. And maybe just kind of, maybe for folks who aren't like super aware of just how these markets work, like what, maybe kind of compare and contrast, like what are maybe the pros and cons of each of these, of taking a loan via GLIF, kind of the DeFi route, or going through one of these centralized providers that, I'm not sure how many of them there are now currently, but I know there's a handful of these guys that are servicing storage providers. But maybe kind of compare and contrast, like what are sort of the pros and cons between these two different approaches right now?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. And I think it comes down to similar trade-offs in other areas as well throughout crypto, right? So what is the risk with depositing money into FTX versus self-custodying your crypto and putting it into Aave, or swapping on Uniswap, or things of that nature, right? So on one hand, on the DeFi side of things, you subject yourself to things like smart contract risk, and you are a little bit more kind of DIY, right? You need to do the swapping yourself. You need to custody your keys. You need to, it's I would say, less user-friendly in some ways. But in other ways, it's actually way less user-friendly, because smart contracts are automated. It's always online. The business never closes for a weekend or a holiday. And there's no humans in the loop. So, for instance, a lot of the CeFi folks, if you deposit your Filecoin with them and you want to get it back, you need to wait for them to actually send it to you. And sometimes there's a 6-month waiting period. And so you have, it's less efficient. And we could see that by how quickly, like, the DeFi solution outgrew the CeFi competitors. Those folks have years of lead time on GLIF, and now GLIF, I don't know their exact numbers, but is definitely the most dominant Filecoin, I don't want to say lender, but deployer of Filecoin capital to storage providers in the ecosystem. And, I think that kind of speaks for itself. It also, because we're so like laissez-faire, don't need to charge much, right? Like it's just code. We don't need to hire staff to manage these things. Of course, there's customer support that we need to, have online at sometimes, but for the most part, this is a completely open, sort of protocol, and that has a lot of benefits. And the CeFi is more closed, it's less accessible, and it's a little less efficient.
I love that, and it seems like given the choice, like the SPs seem to be preferring your solution versus the centralized ones. Like now that they actually have a choice of where they can go, they have decentralized, they have centralized options. Or there's some
of them.
So there's certain, everyone has their own risk profile, right? But folks seem to be
totally
preferring this option over others in certain instances.
100%. I think there's some reasons, if you have a lot of bargaining power as a storage provider or even a liquidity provider with a CeFi desk, like you can negotiate, right? So those aren't like hard coded rules in my book. With smart contracts, these are things that can't really be changed. So when a storage provider comes to us and say, hey, can we get a better borrowing rate? It's just like, I wish. But like this is smart contracts. Like there's not a negotiation to be had.
Right.
Whereas a storage provider that goes to a CeFi lender, they can say, hey, we're only going to do this at X% or Y revenue share, or and that's a conversation that you have to have. And so I find a lot of storage providers try to negotiate with GLIF by telling us what the CeFi counterparts will give them, but then the CeFi counterparts don't have the capital to actually do it. So. And sometimes they definitely do as well. So I think, it's just different, and there's pros and cons to both ways.
Well, and I'm really excited to just learn more about this, and I appreciate you coming on to kind of explain the mechanics of how this all works. And I've always found that the kind of the GLIF model, or the DeFi and Filecoin model, is a super interesting example of where like DeFi meets the real world, right? Where with a lot of these other DeFis that, protocols that we've used over the years, like the Aves and compounds and whatever else, right? With a lot of these things, it's not like really clear where the yield comes from, right? Especially when you kind of go up the risk curve onto some of the crazier stuff. And it's kind of like, sometimes you're like, all right, like some guy on Twitter's talking about this, seems like a cool project. Let's just throw some money in there and see what happens, right? And it's like, nobody really knows where the yield's actually coming from on these things. But with what you've built here, you have there's an actual brick and mortar business that is repaying their loans, right? And that's where the cash flow is coming from. That's where the yield on it's not just like some magic number go up type of thing, right? There's actual cash flow behind this that's generating these returns, that's generating the yield on these iFill tokens that I own. So I just love that concept that this is like, in my view at least, this is the purest expression of where like DeFi meets the real world in a sense.
No, 100%. I think like I try to pride myself on being a builder that doesn't select technologies for reasons that don't matter. And what I mean by that is, if I'm building something, my goal as a builder is find the best way to build it, right? And if there's a problem in Filecoin, for instance, the storage providers can't get permissionless access to Filecoin for pledging, because they need to go through all these long processes with CeFi folks and get to know them. And then there's, jurisdictional issues and just all sorts of different, global issues that come. And liquidity providers, it's the same way. It's inaccessible. Early on in Filecoin's birth, Anchorage was running a pretty successful program, but to even get started to deposit Filecoin in it, you needed like an exorbitantly high amount of money. And so this was just not accessible. And so as a builder, when we are presented with that problem, it's really nice to say, oh, wait, actually, like DeFi is the right solution, technically speaking, and smart contracts for this problem. And when you choose technologies based off merit and not just because it might be popular to use something, you end up doing better, I think. Because like for me, I would not want to build the CeFi version of this. It would be a lot of like manual effort and things. And that to me is not the optimal solution. So yeah, I think you bring up a good point there. It's very it's a very clean application of DeFi in this context. And to defend the Aves and folks, I think some of the blue chip DeFi protocols on other chains have also found that blockchains are really good use for this. So margin lending, like what Aave does or Maker, and that's a real example of when DeFi is superior to CeFi again. And I think those ones do have answers to where some of the yield comes from. But I totally get what you're saying about others, where it's like, hey, we might have just chosen to build a DeFi platform without actually examining what problem we're solving. And those are the protocols that are really ripe to pay yield that is magical because they need to bootstrap liquidity or users or whatever it is. And that's where things can get a little dangerous and risky.
Yeah, once you start going up the risk curve and you're looking at these things that are paying out, 100% returns on Binance Smart Chain or whatever, then it's like, okay, like this, just buyer beware, right? This might not be as good as it looks, right? But yeah, I appreciate the color there, and yeah, I just love this idea. I mean, I've a question. I was actually going to ask this a bit later on, but maybe since we're on this topic right now, we'll move this up. But I know that you guys are at GLIF are kind of looking to take some of this infrastructure you've built for Filecoin and trying to deploy this to some other kind of similar DePIN type protocols that have kind of the same I guess general idea of Filecoin, right? Where there's kind of there's hardware, it's distributed, folks need collateral, it's the same kind of idea, right? And I was just hoping you take this idea of like this DeFi meets the real world type of use case, this idea. And how do you see this kind of deploying to potentially like other DePIN protocols, whether they be like decentralized GPU compute type things or other types of DePINs we've seen popping up over the last couple of years?
Yeah, great question. So when you think about, I think it helps first to understand why these networks require a stake. And in Filecoin's case, it's to keep untrusted participants honest, right? So you don't know in the Filecoin context necessarily who these storage providers are. And if you want to trust someone to store your data, you want some assurance that it's going to be there when you want it back. And that is the role of the stake, or what we call pledge, in the Filecoin ecosystem. It's a mechanism for keeping folks honest. And if they are dishonest, that security deposit or that pledge starts to get slashed. So that pattern of we don't know who all these hardware providers are, so we need a mechanism to keep them honest, is a repeatable problem across many different DePIN networks. And the solution, again, it comes in different flavors. Some networks actually just ship their own hardware devices that keep the folks using them honest in some way. Or there's other networks that allow you to tap in with existing hardware that you have, like Filecoin, and then you need a staking mechanism. And so what GLIF can do is apply a very similar looking protocol to other DePINs that require a stake, so that the node providers of those networks can borrow the capital necessary to put that stake on the network and grow and bring more hardware online, which ultimately helps the network as a whole become more secure, more profitable, all the good things, I would say. And so that's thing one, is can we help other DePIN networks who are suffering from Filecoin like economy problems with a GLIF solution? And the answer there has been very clearly yes for us, which is we've just started to kind of open the doors to listening to the problems that other DePIN networks have, and they all sound like this or something of this flavor. There's a second model which we've just started to introduce, actually, like more privately in sort of a pilot mechanism, which is, so if you think about those like DePIN networks, there's kind of two areas that require capital. One area is the stake, like we were just talking about in Filecoin and potentially other DePIN networks, and that's kind of the GLIF core model as it is today. The second area is the actual hardware itself. So if you want to get GPUs to contribute resources to a GPU network, how do you acquire the capital to get that? And so GLIF has also been running new types of models in small pilots to play with different infrastructure funding models, which is very interesting. So those would be more fiat denominated pools where folks can deposit, which goes to financing hardware to mine these networks, which then allows us to also stack more collateral in the native asset when you stake onto them as well. So that's kind of the two things that we're working on in parallel there in terms of bringing capital efficiency to other DePIN networks.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jonathan, for your time. Really appreciated the conversation here, and it's great learning more about your story, as well as just the really fabulous insights you have just from like many years just in the trenches, like building out Filecoin, building out tooling, just being a really kind of core contributor to the community. So on behalf of everyone at the foundation and the Filecoin community, just thank you for all the work you've done over the years, and wishing you a lot of success here in the months and years to come with GLIF. And yeah, so appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you next time on DWeb Decoded.
Thank you. And thanks for your support.